Hello, audience, and Brett, and Kyle. Okay.
Essentially. Is this recording?
Yes.
Okay.
What counts in life is not the mere fact that we have lived, it is the what difference we have made to the lives of others that will determine the significance of the life we lead. This is a quote by Nelson Mandela, and these are some of the sources that I used for my speech. I used mirror.com, biography.com, Learning About Forgiveness from the Life of Nelson Mandela, which was a book by Jeanne Strasabosco, and theguardian.com, and Long Walk to Freedom, which was Nelson Mandela's autobiography, and also a movie that they made about it. So my three main points, my name is Robin, and I'm just going to be talking about the life of Nelson Mandela, and my three main points that I wanted to talk about were his early life, his fight to end apartheid, and his imprisonment, and the last topic being his eventual freedom and his presidency and retirement. Nelson Mandela wasn't born with a strive to be free. While he was younger, he thought that he had all the freedom in the world. He thought as long as he obeyed the rules of his father and he obeyed the laws of God, that he was free to do whatever he wanted. In his autobiography, it says, "It was only when I began to learn that my boyhood freedom was an illusion, when I discovered as a young man that my freedom had already been taken from me, that I began to hunger for it." So he's just kind of saying here that he first developed this freedom whenever he realized that he wasn't free in his country of South Africa, that blacks weren't equal to the rest of the country and they weren't being treated correctly, and this kind of when it first implanted in his mind that was something that he wanted to change. Nelson Mandela was born in South Africa in 1918, and he was raised in a village outside of the town, and he spent most of his time raising cattle, and he was born, his parents gave him the name Rulishwa, which means to stir up trouble, which was a very fitting name considering the trouble that he stirred up in his fight for freedom later in his life. Both of his parents were illiterate, and his mother decided to send him to a Methodist school when he was younger, and it was here that he got his English name Nelson, because the teacher asked for his English name and he didn't have one and she couldn't pronounce his real name, so that's where he got that name from. And then after his schooling there later in his life, he decided to go to college at the University of Fort Hare, where he decided to pursue a bachelor's in arts, and it was here at the University of O'Hare that he first came into contact with the ANC, which is the African National Committee, and this was a committee of African people that were fighting for equal rights and freedom. It wasn't while he was in college that he decided to join the ANC. He joined the ANC a little bit later in his life. Okay, so just kind of learning a little bit from his early life, kind of learned about how he developed this drive to fight for freedom, and this kind of transitioning into talking about what exactly he did to fight for his freedom. So I mentioned earlier, just a second ago, the ANC, which was a group of people that were fighting for freedom in South Africa, and he joined the ANC in 1944, and he worked with the ANC and actually became a leader there. And once he became a leader, the ANC became a more violent group. The fight for freedom had been relatively peaceful until Nelson Mandela saw that there needed to be a change because the government wasn't responding to the peaceful negotiations. So they began a more violent path, and they even set up bombings and things like that meant to ruin in places that were connected with apartheid, but he always kept in mind that they didn't want to hurt anyone, so they always made sure no one was around the places that they were at. And mentioning apartheid a little bit was just something that the government in South Africa set in place that separated blacks and kept them from their freedom in South Africa. And this is something that the ANC was fighting to end and that Nelson Mandela was fighting to end. And through just talking about how it became like a violent fight, Nelson Mandela became a wanted man, and people began to look for him to try and arrest him, and he hid for a while, but he was eventually found and he was arrested. And when I was researching this, it's just kind of easy to see like the parallel between the fight for freedom that Nelson Mandela had and the one that like Martin Luther King had in America, and the fights for freedom that the blacks had in America is just similar to the ones they had in South Africa. And just one difference that really stood out was that Martin Luther King got arrested a lot, but Nelson Mandela was actually, when he was arrested, he ended up being in prison for 27 years. He was sentenced to life in prison, but he ended up getting out 27 years later, which isn't that great. But in prison, he was at a prison in Robben Island for 18 years, and at this prison he was only allowed one visitor every year for only 30 minutes. So that was hard for him, but in the prison he was able to become a leader within the prison, with the other prisoners, and with the guards at the prison as well, started to gain respect for him and who he was. So 27 years later, while Nelson Mandela was in prison for 27 years, that fight for freedom still continued. Won by his wife, Winnie Nelson. She also continued his work while he was in prison, and the ANC also continued that fight for freedom. So Nelson Mandela was finally released in 1990, and right after he was released from prison, he talked to a crowd of people and he told them, "Today the majority of South African and black and white recognize that apartheid has no future. It has to be ended by our decisive mass action. I have waited too long for our freedom." So soon after his release from prison, he began working with the ANC again, and this time as the president of the ANC. And just soon after, the apartheid ended in South Africa and they won over their freedom. And soon after that, Nelson Mandela was elected the first black president of South Africa, and this was a position that he stayed in office for only a year, because he decided that he only needed a year to set the foundation that would put this country on the right path. And soon after that he was president, he decided to retire, but still in his retirement he was very busy. He told in a press conference, he said, "When I told one of my advisors a few months ago that I wanted to retire, he growled at me and he said, you are retired. If that is the case, then I should say that I want to retire from retirement." In Nelson Mandela's retirement from retirement, he was still also a very busy man. He worked a lot and made some foundations like the Nelson Mandela Foundation, the 4664 Foundation, and the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund. So in conclusion, just talking about overview, just learning about the life of his early life and his fight for freedom and his presidency and his retirement. Nelson Mandela was a very important figure in the fight for freedom in South Africa, and I think that his actions and his fight can go to inspire anyone, not just someone who's fighting for freedom, but I think his work can go to inspire anybody who is striving to reach any kind of goal.
Thank you.